In tonight's Government Insider, the implications of a Trump presidency on the federal workforce. The Government Business Council, research arm of Government Executive Media Group, just released the results of an eye-opening survey. It pulled a random sample of their subscribers about politics and campaign 2016. Let's talk results with Francis Rose, federal government expert, radio host, and publisher of francisrose.com. All right, let's start with political affiliation. This poll asked subscribers to identify as Democrat, Republican, or Independent. 28% chose Democrat, 26% Republican, 35% were Independent. Now, those numbers might surprise some people. Did they surprise you, Francis?
Well, thanks for having me on, Morris. No, they didn't really surprise me that much. The federal workforce is a lot more reflective of the general population across the country than I think a lot of people believe. There's probably a preconceived notion that most of the people that work for the federal government are Democrats or liberal. And I have not found that to be the case in the years that I've worked in the federal government. And that may stem from the fact that the federal workforce is fairly heavily unionized compared to the private sector. It's not overall, but compared to the private sector, there is a lot of union representation.
Right.
So no, those numbers didn't really surprise me. They seem to be very similar to the general population of the United States right now.
Now, Donald Trump holds a strong lead among Republican or Republican-leaning feds. He earns 32% of the vote. Senator Ted Cruz is second with 17%. Does Trump have a history of supportive statements regarding the federal workforce?
Well, I chuckled when you said Donald Trump's name. I want to be very clear, Morris, only because every discussion about the presidential race seems to start with Donald Trump. It's not a reflection on my sentiments about Mr. Trump. He doesn't have much of a history of statements about the federal workforce at all. And what he said is kind of all over the map, like it seems to be about a lot of the statements that Trump has made. A lot of the statements that he's making on the campaign trail as he seeks the Republican nomination are different or at least varied from what he's said about the same topics in the past. So he doesn't have a reputation really for beating up the federal workforce. He doesn't really have a reputation for saying they're wonderful. He just kind of has a reputation for talking about the federal government like he talks about a lot of other things in very broad strokes rather than in specifics.
Now, here's another figure. 1 in 4 workers say they would consider leaving federal service as Trump is elected. What do you make of that?
Well, what I make of that is that seems to be pretty consistent with numbers that we see whenever the transitions are about to happen. The statistic that I thought was most interesting in the piece that you referenced was that 6 in 10 respondents said they would be embarrassed if Donald Trump was their boss. 6 in 10 federal employees would be embarrassed that people would know that he was their boss. 5 in 10 would be embarrassed if Hillary Clinton was their boss. And so for people who just assume that federal employees follow along with the Democratic Party regardless and they will take whatever the Democratic Party dishes out, that's pretty surprising, I think, that the person that just about everybody believes will be the nominee of that party would be somebody that federal employees would be embarrassed by just a little bit less than Donald Trump.
That's very interesting. So on the left, Hillary Clinton received support from more than half of those Democratic-leaning feds. I'm taking it that you're not surprised here.
No, I'm not surprised by that. That seems to, again, comport with what a lot of people are seeing in the Democratic Party. I mean, we'll know tomorrow morning for sure exactly what Iowa had to say, but Secretary Clinton and Senator Sanders seem to be running fairly closely. Depending what day it is, seems to be an indication of who's leading. But they're running pretty well neck and neck, and that doesn't surprise me that those numbers look pretty much the same inside the federal workforce, Morris.
Now, you just sat down with Dave Mader, Controller General at the Office of Management and Budget, and Carlos Otal, Managing Partner of Grant Thornton's Public Sector. What did you find out?
Well, one of the big things that we talked about, and there's a link to this discussion at francisrose.com, was the fact that about a year from now, Dave and the other people who are serving in the Obama administration won't be serving in the Obama administration anymore because January 20th of next year, the Obama administration's out of office and Secretary Clinton or Senator Sanders or one of the Republicans will be taking over. And so now is the time, in fact, before now is the time that the federal government has started to think about that transition. And the Obama administration, as Dave told me, is laying out the ways that it will be ready to hand over power on January 20th. It takes a long time to get ready for that. And of course, they still have the business of the government to conduct between now and then. So the administration, really, what I learned, is operating on two tracks. They're preparing to hand off, and they're also continuing to do the work of the American people, Morris.
So among all this noise that we're hearing throughout the next campaign, all the noise, but in the meantime, we've got slow and steady with a good transition. People are learning, regardless of which candidate wins. The second and third tier career feds are planning a nice transition.
That's
right?
exactly right. And what's really striking is that in the past, it's been common when we get to January, February, March, if a presidential candidate were to start talking about when I become president and making moves, the candidate on the other side would accuse him or her of measuring the drapes. We saw this in 2008
right.
when President Obama, then Senator Obama, started to talk about his transition in the summer, and Senator McCain said, "Oh, you're measuring the drapes and you're presuming that you're going to win." And it turned out to be a good idea, because President Obama was able to get some of his important nominees in place early on in his administration.
Francis Rose, federal government expert and publisher of francisrose.com. Thanks again.
Thanks for having me, Morris.